All right. As we begin looking at Adobe Animate, we're going to create this first project as an animated logo. We're going to bring in the assets from Adobe Illustrator and we're going to position them, manipulate them, and animate them inside of Adobe Animate to eventually produce an animated GIF that can be used on mobile or the web or pretty much whatever you want. This project is going to introduce you to the foundations of working inside of Animate. So let's get going. All right, we're going to create our first project inside of Adobe Animate, and this is going to involve an animated logo. So before we get into it, let's create a new document and also have a brief overview of the Animate UI or user interface as we sort of go through this and establish our document settings. So when you open up Animate for the first time, you'll notice right in the middle, we've got a big welcome screen. This welcome screen has a number of different things here. There's the home area, which we see right now. There's also a learn tab. So the Learn tab, if you switch to that, it shows you a bunch of different tutorials that have been created to help you learn different things inside of Animate. If you wanted to see how to draw and animate, here's a tutorial for you. So let's go back home. And notice that we've got a number of different categories up here. These are basically different presets that can be used for different intents. So if we were looking at ads, there's a bunch of ad presets here. If we're looking at character animation, there's presets for that. If we're looking at social platforms, we have a number of things for Facebook and Twitter and so forth. What I'm going to do is actually go to Advanced. And in Advanced, we can choose from different publish platform document types. So these can be things like HTML5 Canvas, ActionScript 3.0, or a number of additional things. I'm going to just choose ActionScript 3.0 for our project and hit Create. Animate's going to go through and create a new document for us. Looking at this, what do we have here? We've got this big white area in the middle, and that is called the stage inside of Animate. Around the stage is what's known as the pasteboard. On the pasteboard, you can have assets sort of reside off there. They can swing onto the stage from off the pasteboard. But the thing to remember is that the user, when you actually publish, the only thing they're actually going to see is anything that's visible within the stage boundaries itself. Right below the stage and the pasteboard, we have our timeline. The timeline has multiple layers, and you can see our different layers stacked up right here. The timeline is also composed of frames. So you can see those frames here. And in this case, our 1 second marker is at the 24th frame. If you note right here, we're at 24 frames per second. That is the frame rate for this document. And all that really means is that in order to calculate time, you're going to need to have 24 frames of content to equal 1 second. Multiply that by 2, and we get 48 frames that equal 2 seconds. You can always change the FPS settings from your Properties panel on the side over here. The Properties panel and the library are sort of grouped together in most instances. And the Properties panel is going to be contextual. So what that means is because we actually have nothing selected right now, we are seeing our document properties. However, if we actually had a tool or an object or a frame selected, we would be able to view and modify the properties for those things. The Properties panel will always change to match the selection. If you look up here, we're in the Essentials workspace. There are a number of different workspaces here. I'm going to keep everything at Essentials for the duration of this course, though. Here we have our Tools panel. We have different selection tools here, different vector drawing tools like the pen tool, the rectangle tool, and so forth. And then some specialized tools, some dealing with color, like the eyedropper tool, or the ink bottle and paint bucket tools. Below that, we have things like enabling or disabling the document camera, the hand tool, and the zoom tool. Right below there, we can see the color for our stroke and our fill, and we can always reset that by clicking on this little widget right here. That resets it to a black stroke and a white fill. All right, so that's a quick tour of the interface. What we're going to do now is save our project. So we're going to choose File, Save. All right, so we can see that I am saving this in my project folder, and I'm going to just name this logo.fla. And an FLA file is the default animate document file type. That takes everything that's in your library and in the core document and really just about everything in the project that you build into Animate, and it compresses it into an FLA file. This is your authoring document, and this is going to be what we're going to be using for the most part. There's also the ability to save this as an Animate uncompressed document or an XFL file. That's a little more advanced, and it has very specific use cases. For instance, if you wanted to share things in a plain text way over something like GitHub or some other version control system, that might be the preferred way to do it. However, an FLA is much more compact and much more portable, and it's easier to manage, so that's what we're going to use. Go ahead and hit save when ready. And we can see up here, we have now saved our logo.fla document. All right, so to get started here, before we do anything inside of Animate, I'm actually going to switch over to Adobe Illustrator. So if we look inside of Illustrator, I have this Adobe Illustrator file called Electric Revenant Productions. And in Illustrator, this is where I've actually gone through and created our logo. We can see here that we have a text layer with different objects inside there. We have a revenant layer, which is basically the face that you see, different little pieces of eyes and teeth and so forth. And going even farther down, we have our box layer, which is just this kind of background container thing right here. So those three layers are what we want to import into Animate itself. So we've got our document set up. We can switch back over to Adobe Animate to actually import this. All right, so inside of Animate, if we go over to File and Import, you'll notice that we have a number of different import options. We can import to Stage, import to Library, open an external library from another FLA file, or even import video files. For this, we want to import directly to the stage. So I'm going to choose that option. And inside of my project folder, you can see there is the Electric Revenant Productions AI file. So let's go ahead and choose Open, but note before we do that, that there are a number of additional file types that we can choose from to open up inside of Animate and import in this manner. Right now we're looking at all files, but you can choose from Adobe Illustrator, SVG, Photoshop, and a whole bunch of other file types. Now, note that we're opening this up as Adobe Illustrator, but you could always have your logo assets inside of Photoshop as well, and things are going to behave in a very similar way to what you're going to see here with Illustrator. So I'm going to just keep that on all files with my AI file selected and open. Now, whether we've chosen to import an Illustrator or Photoshop document, what we're going to get is the ability to choose the different layers that we are going to import and how those layers will be imported. So we can collapse all these here, and we can see there's our text, revenant, and box layers. And if we go down inside, we can see the different objects in there. So we can import this as editable text, as vector outlines, or we can render it as a bitmap. I'm going to choose vector outlines here, which is going to take our editable text and create shapes out of it. Perfect. For our revenant layer, we could play with this if we want to. Editable path is the default for these vectors, and that's going to work out just fine for me. And similar thing to box layer, we've got a group of objects with an editable compound path within. That's just fine. All right. So looking down below, we can choose how we want to convert the Illustrator layers. And what we want to do is change these Illustrator layers to animate layers. Right now in our animate document, we only have a single layer. What this is going to do is add these 3 layers from Illustrator in as new layers on top of that layer 1 layer. We could also choose to bring everything into a single animate layer, or even bring things in as individual keyframes. But that's not what we want in this case. We want animate layers. We're going to place our objects at their original position from the Illustrator document. We can choose to just flatten everything as a single bitmap, but that's not what we want because then we're not going to be able to actually animate our logo. We could import unused symbols, and most importantly, we can set the stage size to be the same as our Illustrator artboard, which happens to be 250 by 250. If you note inside our animate document here in the properties panel, our width is 550 and our height is 400. So that is quite a difference. But this is what we're aiming for here, 250 by 250. So that's going to work out just fine. When ready, go ahead and hit import. And notice right away, we've got text, revenant, and box layers. Now, this isn't exactly centered any longer, but that is something that we can fix quite easily if we just hit this little center stage button right here above the stage. And I could even zoom in quite a bit since it is a little small on this monitor. So zooming in at 200%, we can see that it's brought everything in really quite nicely from Illustrator. With our Illustrator assets brought into Animate, let's now have a look at the timeline and see if there might be some additional things that we can do to manage these assets, to rearrange our layers, and even group our layers into layer folders. So notice we have our text here, and if I go ahead and have a look at some of these options for each layer, this first one here, which looks like a little green square in this case, if I click that, what happens is we actually see everything in outlines. And you can do this to any of the layers that you want. Choosing the sort of control above all the layers is going to apply that to all the layers. And this just toggles on and off, back and forth. The little eyeball indicates whether the layer content is visible or invisible. So if I turned the eyeball on here, or rather put an X there, you can see that we no longer can view the text. Same thing with the box or even the revenant face here. Locking content with the lock is going to make it so that we can't actually select or modify any of the stuff in that particular layer, the text layer in this case, that is actually locked down. This is really good for if we want to work on additional layers and we don't want to sort of by mistake actually like change something that's supposed to be locked down and that we don't want to pay attention to at a specific point. So I always suggest locking down all the layers that you're not currently working with. Now, there are some things we can do to layers even when they're locked down. So if you notice here, our revenant and box layers, they're basically this whole icon right here. And if we wanted to sort of group these together inside of our layers panel here in the timeline, what we can do is click on New Folder, which is right above the timeline. And then we can go ahead and name that. So I'm going to just name that icon. And then we can drag and drop different layers inside of our icon folder. Notice when they're in there, they're actually indented a bit from the side, and I can go ahead and collapse that entire folder so I don't see the layers that are within it. In order to actually have any sort of animation, we need more than a single frame. By default, inside of any animate project, it always starts out with one frame. Now this red line here with the little square, this indicates where our current playhead position is along the timeline. So right now we're at frame 1 because there really is no other frame here that we can deal with. Additionally, these frames appear very small right now. There are some controls over to the side here that we can use to make them a bit bigger. So this little slider here is going to widen any of these for us. So you can see how much wider they are now, each individual frame here. We can also use this menu right here. And of course, you can make adjustments with the slider if you need to as well, or even reset to the normal sort of view here. So I'm going to keep it somewhere around there in the middle between both extremes. And that's going to be pretty good. I can easily see that this is 1 second and here's 2 seconds. So if we want to actually extend our frame spans here, you can see we only have the single frame of content. If I want to take out the text to 2 seconds, I can select the frame at the 2 second mark. And if I right click, I can choose Insert Frame. Now that I've done that, you can see that the frame span extends all the way to the 2 second marker. And if I scrub here, we can also see that the content inside of the icon folder on these other 2 layers only exists on that single frame because we haven't extended that frame span out for those 2 layers at all. What we can do is click and drag to select multiple frames across layers. So both of the frames in the Revenant and Box layers at the 2 second marker are now selected. Another way you can insert frames and extend the frame span is through the menu up here. So if I choose Insert, Timeline, I can choose Frame from right here as well, or even a keyboard shortcut of F5. All right, now we can scrub our timeline by using the playhead right here to see exactly how things look across our entire animation. However, of course, there really isn't any animation going on yet because there's no change in properties over time. All we have is the same exact information, same assets, same properties on every one of these frames. So we now have our different assets arranged in our project. However, if you notice, let's go into our properties panel here for the document. So to get to document properties, just deselect anything on the stage. So if I had something selected, if I clicked anywhere in the pasteboard where there isn't anything that's actually a visual element, it would select the document itself. So down here, we can change the stage color. And notice if I hover over any of these color swatches to change the stage color, that the actual little skull inside of our logo changes color too. And that's because there isn't actually anything there. So what we need to do is fill this in with white. So to do that, I'm going to create a new layer right above the Revenant layer. So with the Revenant layer selected, I'm going to click the New Layer button. Let's double click on that layer name and rename it to Skull. Hitting enter will commit that. And now we can draw within that layer. Note that all my other layers are actually locked right now to be safe. What we're going to do is over in our toolbar, choose the oval tool, and we want the fill to be pure white, like a nice skull. And the stroke we're going to disable by using this little swatch here. It's a white square with a red line through it. There we go, no stroke. Now, this option here, object drawing mode, right now it's on. We'll see the difference between having this on and off in a little bit. However, right now, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag to create this particular circle here, this oval. Now, note as you pull it, it's a little weird looking, right? You can have all sorts of different oval shapes, but if you want it to be a perfect circle, you just hold down the shift key. And as you pull that, it's a perfect circle. And we're going to make it a little bit bigger than the actual skull itself and release the mouse cursor. So now if I go ahead and choose the selection tool, let's go to here inside of our timeline and turn our outlines on so we can see how these different things appear in outline form. So here is our object that we just drew. We can shift that over with either our mouse or our arrow keys, as I'm doing here, until it's sort of centered and around, filling up the skull itself. So outline mode is a good way to be able to work with things that are obscured because you can obviously see past them. Now, if we turn outline mode back off on all of these layers, now it's obscuring everything below it so we can't see it anymore. And note that this is actually, it's obscuring everything. We need to see the actual revenant face here. So what we need to do is click to select the skull layer and click and drag that below the revenant layer. There we go. That's pretty good. So now it's below the revenant layer. We may need to transform this a little bit more just to make sure it's filling up everything that we need it to. And we're also going to pull the box layer up above that to fill everything in. So you can see the difference as we sort of shuffle these layers around to how the Z ordering or stacking order works with our content. Let's go ahead and lock that layer. And then if we click on the pasteboard to deselect everything and go back to our document properties, let's check out the background coloring. And you can see now we're able to actually choose another color. Let's choose something very bright and dangerous looking like this color here. There we go. You can see that the skull retains its white nature. So as mentioned, let's unlock this skull layer once again and choose the oval layer. Now, we have object drawing mode on right now. I'm going to draw 3 circles across one another like that with object drawing mode on. And then let's go ahead and turn that off. And then do the same thing down here. Draw 3 circles. Okay. Now let's switch to our selection tool and see sort of how things work. So inside my group of drawing objects here, I can select each one and reposition it without any issue whatsoever. We can see in the properties panel that these are drawing objects. They don't interfere with one another at all. However, if I click on one of my shapes, we soon find that they've collided and merged into a single shape object. So this is sort of how shapes work inside of Animate. If I choose my oval tool again with object drawing mode off, and let's choose a different color. We'll choose this green color. This is a way that we can actually create shapes and modify shapes by drawing additional shapes upon them, because that allows us to select and delete those particular shapes and thus make entirely new shapes. So, using shapes allows you to merge and remove content from these different shape objects, whereas object drawing mode is going to allow you to retain the original shape properties and parameters so that you can rearrange them as you move on. And before we move on, we're going to just draw a selection rectangle around all of those and delete them by hitting delete on our keyboard. Now that we have a number of objects on our stage, let's have a look at the different properties that are available to us. So if I have the selection tool chosen over here in my tools panel, the little black arrow, I can see right now, since I have nothing selected, that we can view the different document properties. So the stage background color, the width, the height, and also the frames per second or FPS value. We've seen all that before. However, we can also now go ahead and select different items on our stage. So for instance, if I select the little yellow part of the eye here, we can see in the properties panel that that is a drawing object, which is sort of a fancy encapsulated shape. So all of the different properties it has are the same sort of properties you would see with an actual shape. Let's go ahead and deselect some of these additional things like our box layer and our skull layer, and we can choose those as well. So here the skull itself we created as a drawing object. And this particular black shape here is a group. So what we can do with any of this stuff is we can break it apart. So I'm going to do a Control or Command B with that selected and break that apart until we get it down to a simple shape. We know it's a shape for two reasons. One is because over in the Properties panel, we now see shape instead of group or drawing object. And notice, as I mentioned, the shape itself has the same kind of properties that a drawing object has. We have stroke and fill, width and height, and so forth. So the second way we can tell this is a shape is because of the sort of white dot pattern that's across everything. Now, if we wanted to convert this back into a drawing object, what we can do is just click this little button here, Create Object. We can see this is now a drawing object. If we wanted to make this a group once again, what we can do is Command or Control G. So once I do this, we're now dealing with a group. Of course, if we want to break out of that group, again, Control or Command B is going to break that apart. So remember, G for group and B for break apart. So let's select another one of these little eyeball pupils here, these little yellow things. And aside from the information we get in the Properties panel, there's also an Info panel that in the Essentials workspace is grouped right here along the side. And if I click on that, I can see some of the same information like the width and the height, the X and Y properties that is displayed right here. But I also get the ability to use this little eyedropper to kind of go over different things. So it's actually sampling real time the RGB values from my mouse cursor position, and it shows the X and Y position of my mouse cursor. So if I move the cursor up to the upper left here, you'll notice that we approach 0, 0 for X and Y. And if I go past there onto the pasteboard, we're now into negative space. So the top left is always the 0, 0 position for the main stage. Now, maybe I want to change the color of this eye. That's pretty simple to do. I can always go into my fill here and make some adjustments. However, we actually get more control by using the color panel, which is docked right here. So with the color panel, we can see this is a solid color. Now we could choose to have a different type of gradient, like a linear or radial gradient, or even a bitmap fill. in which case it will use a bitmap image in our library as the fill for a shape. However, what I want to do is just make some adjustments to make this a little brighter. I want a brighter, more richer yellow color, or we could pull it down. You can make all these different choices as you go through here. And notice we have the HSB color space here. That's hue, saturation, and brilliance. And you can switch between these different values as primaries. So if I'm looking to increase the yellow, hue might be a good one to work off of. We also have RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and then A is our alpha property or our transparency. We get a little hex value here as well. And you can see on the stage that this is definitely a brighter yellow. Let's go ahead and add this to our swatches so that we'll be able to use it in different places. So I'm going to click Add to Swatches. And then if we go to our swatches panel, which is right here, grouped, we can see below my normal swatch set that I have a little yellow swatch that's been created for us. And I can now apply this across our application. However, another thing we can do is actually convert this into a tagged swatch, which has very specific properties that we'll see in a moment. To convert this to a tag swatch, we make sure that swatch is selected. And then down here, we click the Convert to a Tag Swatch button. Here we can have a color definition with a name and the color information. I'm going to call this Yellow Eyes and hit OK. As you can see, this is now a tag swatch. It appears in our tag swatches. And also, because it's been applied to this object here, we see that the tag swatch with the little white corner right here has been applied to this object. So if we click on the other eye, we see this isn't using a tag swatch. This is just using a color value. But we can go ahead and click the fill color, and here are our tag swatches. Let's go ahead and apply that tag swatch right there. All right, so now both of these little eyes are actually using a tag swatch. What makes this really useful is that tag swatches, if you change the swatch itself, it'll cascade across the document. So let's go into our swatches once again, and let's double click on this yellow eyes tag swatch. So what I can do now is change it to something like this red color here. And once I hit OK, you can see anything that's been tagged with that swatch automatically gets that new color applied. Now, I want to go back and have that nice yellow color again. So I can go ahead and make these adjustments here. And once I hit OK, all the tag swatch colors, the objects, turn back to yellow. Before we move on, let's have a look at some of the design principles and design considerations you'll need to know when working in Animate or really any other application of this kind. You must be familiar with basic design elements and principles. These include concepts such as emphasis, movement, balance, unity, color, white or negative space, alignment, line, contrast, the rule of thirds, and proximity. You'll also need to understand symmetry. This involves horizontal, vertical, diagonal, radial symmetry, and asymmetric layouts. Additionally, when we're working with typography, understanding things to do with leading, kerning, and tracking. Note that overcrowded layouts, extraneous graphics, and distracting colors should be avoided at all times. Additionally, consider these design best practices when working inside of a project. Be sure to achieve overall consistency in design and any navigation. Keep your target audience in mind when determining project design elements. Always consider screen resolution, PPI or pixels per inch, the device CPU or GPU, especially when targeting mobile, download speed, browser types, if targeting a browser, and also input types across desktop and mobile. Lastly, employ a mechanism to preload elements if that's necessary to your target platform. All right, we're now going to go ahead and perform some animation using shape tweens. So, having a look at the layers we currently have, let's go ahead and lock our entire icon folder. And what we'll do is insert a new layer on top of our text layer. So select the text layer and create a new layer. And we'll just rename this to, just say black. It's just going to be a black shape. So that's going to work out fine. So on this new layer, we're going to go ahead and create a black rectangular shape with rounded corners to sort of match what's in our iconography here, our logo. So selecting the rectangle tool, I'm going to go ahead and choose to have black as my fill color. And I don't want any stroke in this case. You can use object drawing mode on or off. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to keep it off. And then since we're using no stroke on this object, these stroke options don't matter one bit. However, I am going to use a rounded rectangle. So I want the corner radius here to be something like 10. All right. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and sort of click and drag, and we're going to hold down the Shift key to make sure that we create a perfect square. And make sure to start it way outside of your stage on your pasteboard. That's going to allow us to sort of bring it down later on. You just click and drag with the Shift key held down, and it's going to make a perfect square for you. As you can see, the corners are rounded like we want. And let's switch to the selection tool and select that object. Since it's a shape, we see this pattern against it, and we can see it's a shape right here in the properties panel. And now what we're actually going to do is use this little panel right here, align. We're going to align to stage, and we're going to align to the very center. That way we know it's going to be right in the middle of our object, of our stage. And if I turn on outline mode for our black layer, we can see it's perfectly placed right here. All right, so let's toggle that back on. And what we're going to do is create a shape tween. To create a shape tween, what we need to do is create additional keyframes. So right now, every one of these layers has a single keyframe at frame 1 where our content exists. In Animate, we can create multiple keyframes, and shape tweens must have at least 2 keyframes to work. So what we'll do is go to the 1 second marker here, and right here above the timeline, there's an Insert Keyframe button. So once I click that, we can see the keyframe from frame 1 is duplicated at frame 24 at the 1 second mark. What we're going to do at this point is use the Free Transform tool, and this allows us to scale our object down. So if I hold down Shift and drag from the corner, we can see that the entire object scales down exactly in proportion. It doesn't change sort of the ratio of width and height. And that's because, again, we have the Shift key held down. So just like when we drag out a rectangle and hold down Shift, it creates a perfect square. When we transform or scale a rectangle with the Free Transform tool, holding down Shift is going to allow it to preserve that same ratio. All right, so let's choose our selection tool once again, and we can see that that covers all of our black spaces here. So from here, it turns from that big square to a little square. And what we also want is somewhere around frame 35, we're going to insert another keyframe. And with that keyframe inserted, what we want to do is actually change not the scale of this, but the opacity. So going over to our fill and stroke, to change the opacity of a shape, you just go into your fill color, and you can see this alpha option right here. Just pull that all the way down to 0 and click away to see that it's fully transparent. Now to actually create a shape tween here, all we need to do is click anywhere inside between two keyframes. We're going to right click and choose from the menu Create Shape Tween. There we go. So immediately you can see that things have changed a bit. We've got this nice color applied, which indicates a shape tween. And if we scrub the timeline, we can see that opacity change over time. So this is our first little bit of animation that we've created in our project. To create a shape tween, again, between these two keyframes in this first bit, when it scales down, just right click and create shape tween again. Now, shape tweens can only be applied to shape objects. So keep that in mind. You can see here we also have classic tweens and motion tweens, and we'll see those later. But right now we just want to stick to shape tweens. All right. So what we see here, let's actually lock this layer down so we don't see that kind of white selection there. And let's hit play to preview this in real time. All right, so it's looking pretty good. It could use a bit of easing though, in my estimation. And what easing does is it's going to, like, as you can see here, it's very linear. It just goes like from point A to point B with like no velocity or anything like that. It doesn't look realistic. What we're going to do is select any of the frames that make up this initial tween where the scale happens. And then over in the properties panel, we can see, since we have the frame selected, the frame properties. And down here, you can see tweening because we do have a shape tween applied. And right now we're using a classic ease. Let's go ahead and click that. And instead of classic ease, we're going to do an ease in out. And from here, we can choose from a bunch of different easing equations. And this little graph here shows you how abrupt or how smooth the different eases will be. So like right here, it eases in a little bit and then speeds up, and then it slows down to ease out. Much more natural movement. Let's double click on quad, and now we have a quad ease in out. And let's preview this now. All right, so that's a lot smoother. I'm actually gonna go in here and unlock. And let's actually transform this a little tighter in, something like that. There we go. That's really good now. Okay, so that's done. We can lock that layer, and let's unlock our text layer because we want the text to fade in from nothing. So what we're going to do is use our selection tool, and let's shift click each bit of our text to select all the text. And we can see that this is right now a group. If you recall, we can do a Command B or a Control B in order to break apart our text or any sort of drawing object or group or anything like that. This is a group right here. So we're going to hit Command B, and now they're little drawing objects. We'll hit Command or Control B again, and we can see these are now simple shape objects. So what this allows us to do is, once again, go to the 1 second mark and insert a keyframe, and then go ahead to frame 35 and insert another keyframe. And on this keyframe, with all the text shapes selected, we're going to go ahead. Notice it's still stuck on frame there, so you can always use the selection tool to reselect those. What you want is the shape selected, and you want to be able to manipulate this fill just like we did earlier. Well, in this case, we want the alpha to be 0 right here. And what we'll do is go to the keyframe at the 1 second mark. Make sure those are all selected. And we want to start the alpha out at 0. So as we go in here, everything's going to kind of pop in. So once again, we need to create a shape tween between these two keyframes. So selecting any of the frames here, right click, and we're going to create shape tween. All right. There we go. Very good. However, of course, right here, we still have our text because it exists in this previous keyframe. Let's go ahead and select everything in that keyframe and hit delete. We'll lock that back down. And note that we now have nothing within that frame span until we get to the 1 second mark. So let's go ahead and play this. All right, there's our animation done with shape tweens and shape tweens alone. So if we zoom in here, let's go ahead to like 400%, maybe even go to 600%. We can see this text. Now, as we scrub through here, notice that Animate's doing some rather odd things to some of our shapes. And a lot of this may be due to the fact that we have a number of different shapes all being tweened at once. Ideally, what you would want to do with shape tweens is to have each shape on its own separate layer in order to keep everything nice and stable. However, there are other ways to deal with this. So let's pay attention, for instance, to this D right here. The D is definitely problematic. Let's unlock our layer. We'll go back to the 1 second marker and let's turn on outline so that we can see all of our shapes at that opacity. Now, notice that in each of the keyframes, everything is just fine with that D. It's only in between when an Animate is actually tweening the stuff that we get that weird aberration. So what we're going to do to try to remedy this is to use shape hints. So to do that, we're going to make sure we're on that first keyframe. And what we're going to do is go to Modify and Shape. And here we can add shape hints. Note that there's a little keyboard shortcut here, Control or Command Shift H. So we're going to add that shape hint. And it's going to basically add it to the center of our stage up here. Let's add a couple more though. So we're going to modify, shape, add shape hint, and we'll add one more to make 3. Add shape hint. All right. So we can see we have C, B, and A. We have our 3 shape hints, and they all have assigned a letter. So if we look here, we definitely need to fix that little bit of the D. So let's start right there. I'm going to take A and plop it right down there at that little corner. With B, I'll put this sort of right there. And let's have a look here. C, I'm going to place at the corner here because that's getting a little weird as well. We can even zoom in a little bit more, go to 800%. So we can really see how this works. Wow, we could even go up to like 1200 and it would probably still be fine. Yep. Okay, so now that we have our shape hints on the keyframe at frame 24, we need to work with the shape hints on the subsequent keyframe at frame 35. So if we look up here, there is C again, B, and A. So we need to pull those down and align them once again to the portions of our shape that we want to match up and try to control a little better. Now going back to the 1 second mark here, we have A, B, C. We need to match those up. So let's go A, B, and C. Notice that these are all green now and no longer red because they're matching locations at our 1 second mark. And at the 1 second mark, they're A, B, C as yellow because they have corresponding matches here. Let's just move that B up. That's pretty close. All right. So now if we scrub back, we can see that even though there is a little bit of something going on there in the D really stays just as it is. It doesn't have much of that weirdness going on anymore. So this is definitely a way to go ahead and have a little more control over your shape tweens by employing shape hints across your timeline. All right, let's go ahead and export this as an animated GIF. But before we do that, note that there's a number of different ways to actually test your animation before you either publish or export. So the first way is just directly in the timeline right here. We can just jump back to the first frame and we can hit play and preview the animation just right here inside of animate. You can also turn on the looping option and just pull out the loop markers to extend across the entire animation, the entire timeline. And then when you hit play, it'll just loop over and over again, and you'll be able to see what that looks like. If you want to preview it without the pasteboard overlay, you can turn on the clip content outside the stage option. And now we'll only see content on the stage as it will look when published or exported. Okay, let's turn looping off. And there it has stopped. Now, if we want to test this, we're going to have to go to Control, Test, or do a Control or Command Enter. As soon as I do this, it's going to export this as a SWIF. And the reason it's doing it as a SWIF is because this goes in line with our publish settings. So this is targeting Flash Player 30. And the scripting type is ActionScript 3.0. If you recall, this is an ActionScript 3.0 document. However, we're not actually going to output this for Flash Player. What we want to do is export this as an animated GIF because there's a lot more places that can play an animated GIF than we'll be able to play back a SWIF for Flash Player. So let's go up to File and Export. Here we can export single images, either through the new dialog or the legacy dialog. We can export movie, which includes a number of additional options, such as exporting as an SVG file or a sequence of PNGs or JPEGs. We can export video, which we'll see later on. But this last one here is what we're looking for this project. We want to export this animated logo as an animated GIF. So let's choose that. And what comes up is our export image dialog. So here we can see that this is a GIF. And what else do we have here? We can see the color table. So these are all the colors that make up our GIF. Down below, we can see the actual calculated size of the GIF. And if we want to actually adjust certain things like the image size, width and height, percentage, we can actually scale this up if we want to. So maybe I want this to be 300% of its authoring size. Note that since we actually have composed this entire thing out of vectors, that everything is still like super crisp. We don't get any kind of corruption of the pixels or anything like that, like you would get with bitmap images. All right, so down here, we can play and test and see how things would look as an animated GIF. We can choose whether it loops once or loops forever, and we can actually preview it right here. Let's pull this back down to like 200%. That's looking really nice. Okay, so if we want that to just kind of go forever, that's fine. Or we could choose to have it go once, whatever your choice is here. But anyway, when you're done, what you need to do is just click Save. This is going to bring up our save dialog, and we can save this as logo.gif and hit Save. If we then go ahead and look inside of Explorer or Finder, depending upon our platform, we can see inside of our project folder, here's our logo.gif file. And we've also got our other files here too. So here's the little Swift file. However, I'm also able to double click on my GIF, and we can view that within the photo viewer on our machine. And with that done, we are finished with this project.